Today we'll be discussing comedy and Twitter, and then we'll be discussing medicine and Twitter. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy to entertainment, and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic for medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today, I'll be asking Ali about how Twitter has affected comedy.
And then I will be asking Asif how Twitter has affected medicine.
Ah, yes. He will flip the script on me, as he often does. So listen, let's get right into this.
Let's do it. Big week. We're talking about Twitter, obviously, because a wee fella named Elon Musk. I mean, if you haven't heard of Elon Musk at this point, what a charmed life you're living. But yeah, Elon has done some interesting things. We're generally going to talk about life before Elon because that's what we know. And maybe I'd be interested to hear what you think happens next in medical Twitter and comedy Twitter with Elon around. But yeah, let's talk about comedy and Twitter. There's a fair amount to stay here.
Yeah, so I think each have questions for the other about how we feel Twitter has affected their field of work, I guess. It is your field of work. I don't know why I had to make that a question. That was quite rude. But yes, that's right. Evil. But yeah, speaking of evil, then what we may assume might happen now going forward with Twitter. So why don't we start off on a positive note, Ali? What do you think some good things are about Twitter and comedy?
Well, I mean, I think, look, Twitter is, it's like the people say money is the root of all evil, but you could also make money to support humanitarian causes. You can also make money, create an organization, staff that organization, and have people try to do better in the world. So I think Twitter is also, like so many things, it's a tool, and you can use it however you want. And I think when people find themselves in a situation when they're just surfing Twitter and not using it as a tool, which I've found myself in that situation, and that's when it starts to feel like a disgusting cesspool. But if you can use it to your advantage, more than ever, there's like money Twitter, there's medicine Twitter, there's, what do you call that? Self-help Twitter. So you can focus really, you can create your own algorithms to a big degree. Comedy gets a little trickier, obviously, because you can create, you can be like, I only want to follow comedians. But when you're doing that, you're also following news about those comedians. For example, if they're getting canceled or if they're getting justifiably or unjustifiably dragged through the mud, you got to see that. So it gets a little bit tricky with comedy. But I think in general, and I'm not sure how many people in hiring positions would say that this is what they do, but I know enough people who proved on Twitter, and it was a great place and continues to be a great place, in my opinion, because comedy, with some exceptions, if you're a great storyteller, sometimes you can use more words to your advantage, but generally speaking, overwhelmingly speaking, comedy is about economy of words. This is early advice to me from a comedy club owner. Don't use 12 words to say something you could say in 6, right? And the idea, when you're starting off in comedy, you use the 12 words because you're trying to fill 5 minutes of time. But eventually you have more material and you'd like to compress as much of it as you can in the time that you're on stage. And also the quicker you get to the joke, the better. It creates a great rhythm. It creates a great setup. Also, audiences get nervous when they're like, hey man, it's been like 45 seconds. There's been no laughs here. This is not what I paid for. This is not what I like, right? Where Twitter doesn't have that. Twitter has a character limit, and within that character limit, be funny is the mandate many writers take upon themselves. And when they can do it effectively, it's kind of like a good open mic for writing.
And so,
however, we'll get to, let's put a pin in that also, because certain things happen at an open mic that should only happen in the small confines of a, brick line.
I want to talk because you're talking about an open mic for billions of people when you're putting something out on Twitter.
Exactly.
But we'll talk about that in a second.
Exactly.
So, but are there examples of people in comedy, or yeah, I guess let's just say comedy specifically, who made it big on social media? Like that's how they were discovered.
Well, I mean, Bo Burnham is a great example of somebody. It was YouTube, but he was a great example of somebody who just sort of started in his bedroom as a teenager, 15 or 16 years old, telling jokes, writing music and songs, funny songs. And I'll never take anything away from that guy. I mean, he had such a great point where a lot of comedians, the older and grumpier ones, were like, yeah, let's see this guy try to kill on a Friday night late show in a club. Then he can call himself a comedian. He hasn't taken his hard lumps. And to that, Bo responds, hey, why don't you try to get hate from 1,000 people an hour online and tell me how easy that is, right? Or how whatever number he said. But it's well into the thousands a week, a month at the very least. So he's, I would say, taken his lumps as well. But Bo Burnham comes to mind. But then there's few people, Megan Amran, for example, she was writing on Twitter and then got plucked. There's a number of people who got plucked for jobs in LA once people were able to see this is a very funny person. It's also like a great business card. They can go back through old tweets and be like, is this a person we want to hire? Is this a comedy style we like? Do they also, well, I mean, look, this is not something I would recommend. This is not something I would say people should be doing, but inevitably your future employer would also be like, do they also say hateful stuff? Do they also get depressed?
Yeah.
Do they also take months off and not tweet? Because if you're looking for, once you start being that Twitter writer, like a comedian on Twitter who's writing jokes, and that's what you're using as your calling card, you can't really take too much time off. You can't be like, hey, at Air Canada, you lost my bag. But you know what I mean? Like, it's just, I don't know. If you're trying to use it as a business card and a resume, you're in there. You're in there for good once you make that decision.
And we'll get to this when it comes to medicine, how maybe you should have two separate Twitter accounts, right? Your professional one. And people, I think a lot of comedy writers don't necessarily start off thinking, I'm going to make it big on Twitter. I just want to say funny things. But, you might want to separate those. So you have your personal one where you can complain to the airlines or Wendy's for, not giving you the extra fries that you ordered.
My onion was spicy.
And then otherwise you can have your professional one. So some people might know this. There was this movie that came out last year, I believe, called Zola. And it was this movie that was based on a 148 tweet thread by this waitress, Azia Zola King.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And sure, most people have read this, right? And it goes like about this trip she took down to Florida, and there was a bunch of strippers, and there's like murder and attempted murder and all this crazy stuff that goes on. It's you keep reading one thread after the other. And it was just a thread by this waitress, and it got picked up and made into a movie, and that she was paid a ton of money for that. So, there is this idea that you can at least create some sort of art on Twitter. So I think we've talked a bit about there is some good that can come of it, especially breaking into comedy. But I'll ask you the opposite question, which I've heard a lot, online and in certain magazines and things like that. So has Twitter ruined comedy? That's my question for you.
I mean, that's a broad question. For some people, it's made their career, and for some people, it's ruined comedy. And I don't want to generalize here, but often the people for whom it's ruined comedy are the ones who are those like, you can't say anything anymore. And it was like, well, why is it so important for you to say something so hateful? That's Kurt Metzger is an interesting case. Kurt Metzger is a comedian who I really liked. He would come to the Comedy Works in Montreal, and he said this once in an interview. So he was writing for the Amy Schumer show. And he was saying something that I found quite interesting at the time. Now it's basically common knowledge, but this would go back to I would say 2015, maybe 2014, 2015. And he was saying back then, and I think it was in an interview with Mark Maron, he was saying that the problem now is that if people take offense to my joke, it's no longer, I'm not going to go see this guy on stage. It's no longer like, I'm not going to watch the show he writes for. It's now find out who he works for, get him fired, make sure he is never employed again by anyone, make sure he is destitute and in the streets, and then boom, move on to the next thing. But our job is done. As long as that person can no longer ever, make a living anywhere else, we're done. And I thought that was quite dramatic, but at the same time, you feel like people do make that their vendetta sometimes, their mission. I'm going to make sure this person is completely, which, in that case, Kurt. But now the problem with Kurt Metzger is that he was apologizing for somebody who was making rape jokes.
Mm-hmm.
And when confronted about that, he dug in even deeper, because in his mind, he's like, I should be able to make jokes about whatever I want. So should that person. And, he went so far that Amy Schumer herself, who's, relishes in the inappropriate humor, was like, I have to distance myself from this guy. He is a friend and I love him, but I could not be more at odds with the things he's saying right now. So he also created huge problems for himself, and he would be like, Twitter ruined comedy. But also, and I find myself in the polar opposite position where I say nothing edgy because I work for the public broadcaster. So I don't want to say, because you don't have the time to explain to people what comedy is. And I've seen it with other comedians. Somebody just hears a buzzword. Somebody hears the word Hitler and then writes in immediately to the Ombud. I was offended. How are you doing jokes about Hitler? I was in the car with my son, and, this is ridiculous. And this is not where our taxpayer dollars should be going. Not for one moment appreciating that the joke was 100% anti-Hitler, and the comedian was Jewish and was mocking Hitler. Any of that, context or nuance and stuff sometimes goes out the window, and you're not really in a position where you can be explaining to people, well, actually, here's what really happened. People don't, once they make up their mind and stuff. And that's more a social media thing than a Twitter thing.
For sure. All social media.
I think the other thing is that, what it feels like sometimes is all the people who got bullied in the days where bullying, we turned a real blind eye to bullying. I think social media now provides an opportunity for many of these previously bullied people to now turn the tables and bully someone else. And I think a lot of them take a lot of joy in that. So then you're like, it wasn't good back then and it's not good now either.
I mean, I'm not Christian, as you well know, but, it's like, who is it? He who is without sin cast the first stone, let he who is without sin. I mean, people have probably all said things that they regret saying. Okay. I mean, I probably said 5 things already in this conversation that I regret. So, and so
I was going to give you the day. I thought you were going to say today that I regret you just in this last 10 minutes.
So, I totally hear that. But, and I guess, you really just admitted on this podcast that you are afraid indirectly of getting canceled. So you censor what you say.
Well, I'll tell you, I do, because sometimes I'll type stuff and I'll be like, this is funny to me. I'll just put this out. And then I have to be like, wait, could this be misinterpreted in some way? Because what if somebody doesn't know me and then I'm just the fact that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, screw it. This is not a hill I want to die on. And the reason I do that is because I've seen the letters that have come in. And unfortunately, the CBC, who I work for, takes every complaint somewhat seriously, which is, I don't know if that's a valid approach. Like, I don't even take every comment about me seriously, and I should. If I get 2 complaints, that could be, a portion of my potential fan base. The CBC has a limitless amount of listeners. Some people only listen to one show. Some people listen. And if you hear, one email comes in from one show that I will never listen to that show again, all of a sudden they take it very seriously. Why? Who cares about one weirdo's opinion about one thing? But they do. And for that reason, look, man, I mean, I always think about, this is what I think about. I think about my son saying, like, can I play hockey this season? And me saying, no, you can't. We don't have money for hockey because Papa made a joke about the environment that seemed insensitive and got fired from the CBC. So we don't have money. And also, please limit yourself to 2 meals a day. Right? I don't want to be in a weird position like that over saying this. I always be, is this the hill I want to die on? And it never is. It never is. And it's never super offensive, but just the fact that I stop and question something, I go, maybe not. I don't know.
Well, it's funny. Trevor Noah just announced he's leaving The Daily Show. And it seems on one hand very recent that he started on the Daily Show, and it also seems like a long time ago. I think it was about 6 or 7 years, because I don't know.
Would actually have people who don't even remember Jon Stewart, if you can believe that. You would have people
That's
who
true.
only know
Trevor Noah. And
Trevor Noah.
it's so interesting. So I don't know if you remember this. Do you remember when Trevor Noah was announced? There was this whole outrage about some tweets. I don't even actually, to be honest, remember what the tweets were about, but people went back through his Twitter history and said
some body shaming, something. I believe it was something related to something Jewish.
I think so too, but I don't actually quite remember. So all this to say, he was almost canceled, and he almost, didn't get the job. But Jon Stewart and the people at the Daily Show said, no, we're moving ahead with this. And now everybody forgets this. Trevor Noah is celebrated, as you said. He is such an insightful comic, and everyone forgets about this incident that happened where he was almost canceled because of his old tweets.
Mm-hmm. Amber Ruffin, I don't know if you know who Amber Ruffin is, a comedian and a talk show host. She was just saying recently, quoted as saying that I don't think anybody ever permanently gets canceled. She says Kanye might be the first. It sounded like she was almost hopeful that Kanye's the first, but she said otherwise, in general, people just get a timeout. Louis C.K. canceled only to come back 5 years later and win a Grammy for his album, right? So then you go, oh, well, that was just really, go sit in the corner until you've learned how to behave. And has he? I don't know.
I agree with what you're saying. When it comes to celebrities that people actually have a desire to see. So obviously, like Michael Richards, it wasn't a Twitter thing, but it was out on social media. He went to a comedy club and he was saying a bunch of racist things. And I think he was trying to work out a bit, but it was just, I don't know if you watched it. It was not funny. It was just ridiculous. But nobody really wanted to see Michael Richards. No one's dying to really see him. And so I think that tanked it. But the less people want to see you, the more it impacts you. It
sticks.
I sent you an article about a comedian who was like a sketch comic who kind of retired from comedy. It seems, and was working as a substitute teacher. And then his sketch videos came out to the students at the school and then the parents at the school, and he was fired. And it wasn't even something that objectionable. I think he was running around in his underwear in one of the sketches. And I'll link to the articles. People can read it, but that was it. He was just kind of canceled. Again, he doesn't have the fame.
Well, as you know, the worst people in the world are parents. So obviously,
yes.
You want to talk about a group that'll mobilize quickly and often without any interest in context or anything like that. Somebody was in their underwear, they're teaching my children, you're out, right? But it was like, hey, this is a sketch and I was 21 and I was doing this for comedic effect. I mean, yeah, poor guy, dead in the water. Delete your old tweets. What are we supposed to say? We have a prime minister who has been blackface, brown face years ago. I don't know what to tell you. Who also, by the way, is still in power. You know that. I'm sure you've seen the news.
I've heard.
We couldn't cancel that guy. So it's hard to.
Yeah, but when you think about the people who don't have power, I do find that interesting, and we're kind of veering away from the topic at hand. But there's this famous case a few years ago of Justine Sacco. For those of you who don't know the story, I know Ali knows it. This was a person who worked as a PR rep for a company, and they were traveling from New York to South Africa on a family holiday, and they would just kind of tweet. So they were making some jokes, as people do. As you said, it's not just comedians who are tweeting and making funny jokes. Often, when you see like a reply to something on Twitter, like it's the average person sometimes who has the best zingers, right?
Yep.
Well, I'll ask you a question about that in a second. But then her last tweet, as she had a layover at Heathrow before she went to South Africa, this was her joke. Okay. She said, going to Africa.
Yeah, she had a few jokes leading up to it as well. Basically, every stop she made along this trip, she was making a joke. Oh, chili, cucumber sandwiches, bad teeth, I must be in London.
Exactly.
Right? That's her tweet when she writes to London. Some other city, some other joke she made, something about BO, somebody's BO on the plane.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So she thought she was on a roll. Comedy comes in three. She used the old rule of three, and then did this tweet, which you will tell people what it was as she left for South Africa. What was that one?
Yeah, okay. She said, going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white. Now, let's try and give her as the most benefit of the doubt as possible with that tweet. What I think she was trying to make a joke at is that in developed countries like North America, where she's from, we've been able to treat HIV relatively well with the medications that we have available, to the point where you can live almost a normal lifespan with it. Whereas in Africa, we have really turned a blind eye to HIV and AIDS in Africa, not making medicines available, not helping with prevention. And so you could be saying, oh, the world has turned a blind eye to this, and because I'm white, I'm not at risk of it. Now, that is probably being extremely charitable.
You're giving the longest bit of slack to this joke and to this person. I'm impressed you're doing that, because within what you just said, which is we have turned a blind eye to the similar plight, the HIV journey of Black Africans, within that lies the insensitivity of the tweet. That's the first thing I feel. Second thing I feel is that, Justine, you're not a comedian. Thirdly, you work for a PR company. You of all people. I mean, you couldn't have been too good at your job, Justine Sacco. You couldn't have been too good at your job if you didn't see the PR disaster that you were potentially going to cause right there. And she had no idea. She took a long flight from London to Johannesburg, it was landed and found out she was fired.
Yeah, she was made a pariah on social media and was fired. And in fact, she's one of the subjects of a book. I think I may have talked to you guys about it before. It's called "So You've Been Publicly Shamed," and it goes through all these different incidents. And she's one of the cases in the book. Yeah, so again, she's not a celebrity. She's not famous, so she was just canceled off the face of the earth. Basically, she's done in terms of being in society. But a couple things just to wrap up this section, Ali, I want to ask you about. One thing is again, it's this idea of non-celebrities or comedians making these jokes on Twitter. Because does it happen a lot where someone makes a joke and then it gets stolen by somebody else, a more famous comedian? Because it happens in comedy clubs, right? You see that all the time. Some guy who's not as famous gets their joke stolen. But what about on Twitter?
I have heard of cases where Saturday Night Live stole a sketch idea from somebody who did it at, Second City or somewhere, some small sketch troupe. Basically, it goes back to what you were saying about people's celebrity and how well they're known. And I think some people it's a power trip. If you feel like you can take a joke from somebody who doesn't have a lot going on, a lot of people will do it. And then what do you get? You get that open mic comic or that young comic and their dozen friends saying, this is not fair. This person stole my joke. And now what? Like, what are you going to do? The person used it on their Netflix special, or they said it on late night. In the old days, it was like, if you did the joke on late night, it was no longer yours. You better just start writing another joke. It's over. It's out of your control. He has done it on late night, right? This was the thing about Robin Williams, which we never talked about in our Robin Williams episode. He was also known for that. He was also high on coke a lot, so he probably didn't know where most of his ideas were coming from. But some people said he was standing in the back of the room. And who had this story? Oh my God, somebody I know had this great story where he said, Robin Williams, I'm in the club and I'm going to go on, and I see Robin Williams come in. And I know for a fact Robin Williams is going to be on late night television later that week. And now I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? What do I do? I don't know if I want to go on, but it's an opportunity to go on. And I'm like agonizing over it. I go on. I have the best set. Friday night comes. Robin Williams did not steal one of my jokes. He was like offended. I'm not good enough for you. I can't remember whose story that was, but it's terrific. But that's how well known he was for stealing, that there was jokes about when he doesn't steal, it's almost an insult. But definitely on Twitter, I think if somebody goes, oh, this person has 480 followers, I have 980,000, I'll just take this joke. Or also, you're scrolling through Twitter like a maniac. It's designed gambling style, scrolling and scrolling. And it's another opportunity for things to come to your mind that you think are your own. Oh, I had this crazy thought. No, you didn't have a thought. You actually read that 3 hours ago, but you've also read 900 other things since then. So I don't know. There's definitely theft. We live in a world where people steal things. There's definitely theft, but there could also be parallel thinking. There could also be like, I mean, it's a classic thing in comedy. You have no recourse. You have no recourse. You have no recourse when it's somebody who's big who takes it. I think it's different if someone, I've seen this a lot. People will
take someone's screenshot of either their joke or a funny meme or something like that, and they'll just retweet it without giving credit to the person who originally did it. That's the type of stuff I have no respect for. And so I think, yeah, maybe there is these different levels of what you're talking about. So I think overall, we think that Twitter for comedy is
neither good nor bad. All right, some flip switching here. Let's talk about Twitter and medicine. And when Twitter first came out, you never would have thought that medicine had any place on it. We've actually been pleased to say that we've had one of the kings of medicine, comedy, and Twitter, all three of those things on our show. Dr. Glaucom Flecken has been here. He's fantastic. And he has an interesting way of, again, as I said, there could be some people on Twitter or in the medical community saying this app is awful. People are spreading misinformation. There could be others on the app who use the app to get their word out on stuff they otherwise wouldn't be able to. And then, Dr. Glaucom Flecken probably, while he's very entertaining, probably raising some, I know when I watch his videos, I'm like, I want to know what that's about. I want to know what that means. What is the story with second year, residents? Why is this? So he probably raises some awareness as well as entertains people. What are your thoughts? Let's start with the same question for you. Medicine and Twitter. What are the good things about medicine and Twitter?
Yeah, the short story with Twitter is I have some concerns, but let's start off with the good things first.
You always have concerns.
I have concerns. Okay, so first of all, let's go through a couple of things. It's accessible, right? Easily available. We talked about before on the podcast about academic journals, how often you need to pay for a subscription. This isn't even just open access journal. It's freely available to anybody around the world to access information, which is great. It's also this two-way communication, which, as you talked about, people can complain about it, because you made an off-color joke for a comedian or something like that, but it allows this collaborative atmosphere between physicians and researchers, between patients and physicians, between patients and patients, to help establish communities for specific diseases, to reach out to people. So that is useful. What about for public health? It's useful for that. Remember at the beginning of the pandemic, flatten the curve, flatten the curve. How do we get that terminology about flattening the curve? That was through social media. And you can criticize what happened during the pandemic or not criticize it or say we didn't do enough, but that's just an example of social media. You can think about reach, and this is something I think the strongest thing is this idea of reach. And I've talked about this before. People ask why I did a podcast when I see people on the street. What made you do that? It's because, as I've said before, if I see patients in a day, how many could I see? Like 15 or 20 on a super busy day? I could probably see that many inpatients and outpatients. What about publications in a journal? I think I've told you my most cited paper has been cited about 350 times by other researchers. But
giving you credit for it, though?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. Yeah. But you think about the podcast, our podcast has had over 100,000 downloads since it started a year and a half ago. And then think about tweets. There's some tweets. One example that I have from one of these articles is about vaccinating for measles. And they did a tweet, this group, and they reached 20 million people in 10 minutes. Right? That is, when you're talking about reach, a podcast isn't bad, but that is an insane reach. So I really do think that's a good point. So if you have a positive message to say or a health promotion type message, you can reach a lot of people. And then probably the last thing I'll mention is how current it is, right? You can get new information out very quickly to a lot of people about tweeting about a new study. Now, again, during COVID, we've seen preprints before they've been peer reviewed coming out. And then, of course, there's problems after the peer review process. But, buying a textbook in medicine, like you're talking about info that's already well out of date by the time the book's published, right? Whereas social media, you get it right away. So I think those are some positive aspects of it.
Yeah. When, basically the flip of all those things are the bad things, I guess, right? You have a reach, but what if you're reaching people with completely false medical information, as we've seen?
Yeah.
I'm sure that's one of the bigger issues.
Exactly. Oh, and before, I do want to mention that, but before I get to this, did I send you this article, Ali, about, it's a question, would Hippocrates be on Twitter?
I guess he would. He'd want to be. All his friends would be on it.
That's right. Well, he was interested in the broad and ethical sharing of medical knowledge, So people say, yes, because of that, he would be on Twitter. That's basically what this article is arguing. I'll link to it. You guys can read it. And he is credited with saying there are two things in the world, basically science and opinion. The former begets knowledge. The latter begets ignorance. And it's so interesting because opinion is such a big thing on Twitter, and it does create ignorance. And it's funny. I'm not sure he would have been on Twitter, but it is interesting. And Hippocrates,
I think he would have been. I think he would have been sharing videos of other people taking the Hippocratic Oath, and he would have been like #my oath.
Yeah. And of course, I don't know if it's worth doing a whole episode, but he does talk in the Hippocratic Oath, like you can't give something to someone to hasten their death. So he totally against medically assisted death. And he also says you can't give something to someone to induce an abortion. Like those are in the Hippocratic Oath. I'm like, okay.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Anyway, so let's just slow down a bit about Hippocrates. He's not everything is cracked up to be. But to get back to what you
But even more reason that he'd probably be on Twitter, huh? He's got some cracks in the foundation.
That's
like
right.
Most people.
That's right.
He'd get fired from the Canadian Medical Society for past tweets.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. Exactly. But getting back to what you're saying about misinformation, there are a couple studies that look at this. One study from George Washington University looked at tweets about healthcare and found that about 20% contained inaccurate information. And of course, we've seen this all the time. There's no way of fact checking. There's no peer review on Twitter. So that is a huge problem. And I'll give you another example of another problem that's based on a few things about research. So one paper, again, I'll link to it. They looked at a bunch of oncology doctors who were active on Twitter. And then they reviewed papers that they had written, scientific papers. And when you submit a paper to a scientific journal, most good journals, you have to disclose whether you've gotten any money from a drug company or have any conflicts of interest. Right? So basically, they found about 80% of the Twitter users they found who are oncologists in the US did have conflicts of interest. In other words, they have received something from a drug company.
That they were, of course, telling people about?
Well, they did say it in the journals that they published in because it's part of the requirements. But what's the requirement on Twitter to say, oh, I think this drug is great, and then have an asterisk and in small font say, I received money from this. There's nothing about that. So it raises this question about how trustworthy the sources are on Twitter. Sure. And I'll give you something else, Ali. I'm very excited about this topic, as you can see.
Okay, good.
So do you think that Twitter user information should be used to recruit people for clinical trials? And the reason I asked was because this company wanted to do that. They were looking to a rare form of leukemia, and they're like, it's so hard to get patients. What if we monitor Twitter activity for like groups that are support groups for this type of leukemia, and we targeted them? So when they went to go submit this proposal to their ethics board, they thought, this actually seems pretty unethical. I don't think you should do this. So instead, they did another study where they just approached people who were in like this leukemia group or posting about it on Twitter and said, would you feel comfortable in us approaching you about this, just to gauge their comfort? And of course, most people on social media were very uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm going through enough. I don't need you knocking on my door, unsolicited knocks. Yeah, I get it.
So, already I'm like in the past couple of minutes, I've talked about a bunch of issues. Another thing that people have brought up, Ali, is the idea of wasting time. Do you know people have studied when doctors tweet, when the peak time of tweeting is?
Is it first thing in the morning?
Yeah, you would think maybe before their clinic starts, or maybe in the evening, right?
Yeah.
Like, just before bed. No, between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. So
really?
The question is that 80% of tweets from verified doctors are published during the workday. So shouldn't you be seeing patients instead of tweeting?
So while my dermatologist is looking at something on my back, looking at a mole, he's actually on his phone tweeting. I don't trust any of you anymore.
Well, that's, you segued into probably the biggest issue is this issue of unprofessionalism. Because what if the dermatologist is taking a picture of your back? He's like, I just need to document this mole you have, Mr. Hassan, and then tweets it out like, get a load of this. And
just to be clear, there's no problematic moles on my back in case anybody was worried.
Yes.
But yeah, if there were, I would be concerned about who I show it to.
So, but this has been an issue. A couple studies, one that felt that in a group of 500 doctors who each had more than 200 followers each, more than 5% of tweets violated patient privacy. Another survey of 237 accounts held by physicians and medical students, a total of over 13,000 tweets were analyzed, and 2% were labeled as unprofessional as well. And so I thought, Ali, I would do a little experiment. Okay. So what,
With me?
with your mole.
Keep your phone where I can see it, buddy.
Okay. So what I did is I follow lots of doctors on Twitter. So I messaged a bunch of them in the past couple of days before we did this podcast, whenever they said a story about a patient or posted an image of a patient. And I asked them I basically phrased it like, just wondering how you got consent for sharing this on social media. No judgment. I'm asking for a podcast. Okay. Most people actually responded to me, which is good. And most of them said, no, we get written consent every time. And we often just say it's for educational purposes. So they may not specifically say it's social media. So I don't know how you feel about that, first of all. Do you think they have to specify whether it's social media?
It's medicine Twitter, it's medical Twitter. So in your mind, is it for educational purposes? People aren't reading these doctors' tweets for gawking purposes.
Right. Correct. And if they're like, check out the gross thing. Yeah. I mean,
no, it is for educational purposes. Yes or no? Or is that a gross exaggeration?
No, I think it is. I think it is. That's why they're doing it. One neurosurgeon who got back to me was like, I actually don't use local cases very much. I use them from other places. And this guy was named Oren Gottfried. So he was quite helpful in kind of guiding me. And so a lot of people who did respond back to me did say yes.
But what does that mean, local? And because it's the World Wide Web.
Okay, I'm going to give you the example by using another example. So this physician from India, I messaged and I said, same question, right? How do you get consent? He said, if the patient's identity is revealed, consent is needed. So, okay, that is not true. And this is what Dr. Gottfried, I think, was getting at. Say he does a surgery on a patient, right? He's a neurosurgeon. Say he does a surgery on a patient, okay? He said, I just removed this brain tumor. Take a look at this, right? So if he just did it in the past week, right? The patient can easily figure out as them, like, well, I just had a brain tumor removed this week in the same city that this neurosurgeon is.
The patient can know.
It's not confidential. And if they don't know that you're doing it, again, he does get consent. But if he doesn't know that they're doing it, that's a big problem, right? It's violating consent. So if you're using, this is a case from across the country, so it's not even my patient, they've gotten consent for them. I'm showing you this example. Then you're not violating patient privacy. But what this doctor from India told me is not true. If the patient's identity is revealed, consent is needed. That is not true. Because if a patient can identify themselves based on it, and same thing if I'm telling a story. Oh, today, I'm making up this story, by the way. Oh, today I saw this 14-year-old patient who had headaches, and it turned out it was because of the medication they were taking for blood pressure or something like that. And then I'm trying to do educational stuff. I'm like, always remember to check the medication list before you try to diagnose headaches. And that patient will definitely know it's them because they know who I am. They know that they had an appointment today. And so I think there's a real misconception about what constitutes keeping the patient anonymous.
So two things were told that weren't true. Number one, what that doctor in India said was not true. And number two, when you said no judgment, that was also not true. It feels like there was a bit of judgment.
Oh, there totally was judgment. I did lie about that. And actually what he said is true to him, but it's not actually true from an ethical point of view. So, and listen, I'll tell you this story since you brought it up. So there's a person I went to university with, not to medical school with, just so it's clear, when I was an undergrad, who became a surgeon and an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. And on Facebook, they posted an x-ray of somebody because they had, those barbecue brushes, right, that you clean your barbecue with. Yeah. A bristle came off, like one of the wire bristles, and got stuck in their tongue because
to their burger.
Yeah, it went into their burger and went in their tongue. Yeah, exactly. So, and they ate. So that when they ate the burger, it got stuck in their tongue. And he took a picture of the X-ray and posted it on Facebook. So now we have a patient who lives in the same city who happened to see the surgeon who had a very unique thing happen to them, whose X-ray is now on on Facebook. And it wasn't Facebook for physicians. It was all his buddies that he's friends with. Okay. So
check out this wild stuff.
I mean, this
is very interesting. Unethical. I was at a dinner party with a friend of my family. It was my aunt's having a party. Friend of the family has a fishbone stuck in the back of her tongue, way back. And she was like, she was trying to get it out. I won't do all the sound effects. This is an intimate medium, but she was trying and my aunt is a doctor. So she had she's a GP. She was trying with a variety of equipment she had in the house to get the fishbone out. And the other aunt was gagging because things are going down the back of it. Just couldn't get it out. So I had to take her to Emerge. And I'm sitting there with her in Emerge, my aunt's kids weren't around. They were out of town at that point. And the doctor, I remember thinking this was weird in the moment, but then I thought immediately, quite quickly, I was like, no, this makes a lot of sense. He called like six other doctors in. And like these residents and other people said, come and see this, come and see this. I had this gut reaction of like, hey, take it easy. It's like my aunt's been trying to barf this thing up for like 3 hours. It's kind of embarrassing. And then of course I was like, no, this is such a unique thing that's happening here that he wants to make sure that everyone else has the same learning experience he does. So if they ever see something like this, they can know how to.
But you want to get ideally permission from your aunt to say, can I call in a bunch of people? And certainly if you go to film it, then you usually, because again, it is useful to film that to show people this is how you do this if you have something like this. But again, you need to have consent from the patient to do it. And so there are a lot of these ethical issues. And by the way, this guy I unfriended and actually complained to the CPSO, which is our college, about him, the guy who did the barbecue bristle. And people I went to university can probably figure out who it is, but I won't mention their name on this. But this whole issue of being unprofessional, I think that's pretty obvious, right? This consent and the issues with it. But it becomes a bit of a gray area. So, Ollie, there was this famous paper that came in a couple of years ago that has since been redacted. It was in the Journal of Vascular Surgery. And they looked at newly graduating vascular surgeons. And they looked at their Facebook and social media, Twitter, Instagram, and they talked about things that were unprofessional. Okay, so again, posting patient photos, perhaps without consent, unprofessional. Fair enough. Then maybe drinking or drug use. Okay, maybe. Yeah, drug use is illegal in most places, but maybe it's not if you live in a place that's, say, legalizes marijuana.
Depends which drugs. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. And then they also included and posing in bikinis, like for women. And it's like, anyway, you can imagine how well this went over. And of course,
what country was this in? This is North America?
It was in America.
What the?
Yeah. I'll link to the article. You can still read it, even though it's redacted. It just has a big redacted stamp on it. It was in CNN. It was picked up. Everyone who's in medical Twitter knows about this happening. They looked at almost...
So any female doctors or med students who were seen in bikinis in any Facebook or social media pictures, this was viewed as some kind of a strike against them,
as unprofessional.
Unprofessional.
Yeah. And so obviously this was craziness, but again, 68% of the accounts were for men.
The Taliban runs this organization.
32% were female. And so, but again, surgery is a male dominated profession, and you see this gender issues coming out. And of course, there was a lot of backlash, and a lot of female surgeons posted pictures of them in bikinis because they're like, what is unprofessional about going to the beach? Right. And trying to relax and get some mental health break. So this is where, this whole idea of who denotes something as unprofessional, we should probably do a whole podcast about that because it's become a bit of a hot topic in medicine. But I think we can all agree those examples of the showing pictures of patients unprofessional, the thing of the bikini is just ridiculous and it shouldn't have even been brought up and probably appropriate.
But the point of all of that is social media becomes this platform for things that can either harm your career or are perceived to harm your career and shouldn't harm your career. So it can go in various directions.
Exactly. Right. So just in the last couple of minutes that we have here, Ollie, I did want to, this is where I'm going to editorialize the most. I kind of have throughout this whole thing. But the biggest problem with Twitter in medicine, which is the same problem everywhere, is this echo chamber, right? And I really saw it with the pandemic. People just want to hear their own opinions, and then that gets reinforced and then you just want to hear more and more of the same opinions, and people in these polarizing camps, and I don't know, it's been really unfortunate. And just people, they say stuff on Twitter that they would never say to somebody in person, and you think, yes, if that's what social media is, don't be so stupid. But I'm like, these are physicians, epidemiologists. There was one person who was criticizing an ICU doctor about, I think the ICU doctor was talking about we have to relax mandates or things like that, which is their, opinion. And the person basically attacked them and said, yeah, you're trying to generate more business for yourself by getting more patients sick. Like, how could you attack somebody like that? It is so disheartening. And the worst part...
Although I will say, Asif, that particular line that you just said, which is, this is stuff people would never say in person, I think that line is starting to fade a little bit too. Not completely, but We've
Yeah.
heard of the Mississauga, Ontario woman saying, "Are there any doctors here who aren't brown?
Yeah.
Can I get a white?"
Yeah, who
And
speaks
people
English,
saying
yeah.
the stuff, the inside voice
Yeah.
stuff outside,
Yeah.
right? So you're seeing that more and more. So, I just bring that up to say that argument at some point in our lifetime will probably
Yeah.
no longer
And,
be
and you're right. We're not going to cure society's ills. This is a big problem that you're talking about. But I think, it's so funny. Doctors, with all the school shootings in the States, a lot of them were speaking out against gun violence. They were told to stay in their lane. And they were like, I'm a trauma surgeon. I see these patients being wheeled into the
quite
ER.
literally
And
my lane.
yeah, this is my lane. So,
Yeah.
so that is fine. But it is very interesting. Doctors are, I've noticed something with doctors on Twitter. A lot of doctors became quite Twitter famous over the pandemic because people want to hear what, especially infectious disease doctors, epidemiologists, ICU physicians. And I remember very distinctly, they would criticize people who were not doctors or epidemiologists, like Nate Silver, for example. So Nate Silver, right? We all know him, statistician, predicts elections and things like that. They're like, you're not an epidemiologist. Yeah, exactly. He's been wrong in the past. They're like, you basically telling him to stay in his lane. So first of all, he is a data guy, so he can analyze all kinds of data. But anyway, they're telling him to stay in their lane. And I find one interesting thing that's happened with medical Twitter over time is, people are moving past the pandemic. Whether the pandemic has moved past them or not, or whether it's still something to worry about, is a constant discussion in society. But so people are less interested in hearing sometimes from these physicians. And then what you see is them weighing in on other issues that have nothing to do with medicine. And it's like, well, now you're going into other people's lanes. And now just because you're a famous person on Twitter, you're weighing in on these things. And then
that's probably the worst, that stay in your lane. When people say that, they're telling on themselves. They're revealing what a piece of garbage they are more than anything else often, right? When LeBron James, the shut up and dribble, just shut up and shoot the puck, go to whoever they're talking about. That's what the stay in your lane argument is. And it's like, oh, you were okay with me as an athlete until I had an opinion about something, and now you're not because it doesn't go with your opinion about stuff. And, and we all have to catch ourselves on that. I find myself like Theo Fleury is a hockey player who I found to be, incredibly tenacious. He's very small as a hockey player. He worked tirelessly, incredible player. And I respected him even though he was on a team that I didn't like. And now he's very much, he's a problematic figure on social media. Let me just say that. And it's, I still don't like people saying, just stay in your lane, talk about hockey. I still don't like that. But I do find it like, I'm seeing it a ton. And it's like, well, everyone's.
Listen, you can comment about anything you want. Yeah.
And we all do.
Yeah.
We all do. And yet we won't let.
It's okay to comment about anything you want. Go ahead. But you're not an expert in it. That's what I want doctors to understand. Half the stuff you're talking about online, you're not an expert in. You have an opinion just like the average person. You're not better than everybody else because you happen to be a physician, unless you're actually talking about medicine and your particular field of medicine. I'm the first to state that when we're talking about topics that I don't know, I ask experts and I do reading. And anyway. I'll just end this section with this. The question is, what do we do about it, about social media? It is ubiquitous. People are using it all the time. So what do we do? We've talked about some things you should not do. The best is the Mayo Clinic has a very brief 12-word social media policy, which is great. Here it is. You ready? Don't lie. Don't pry. Don't cheat. Can't delete. Don't steal. Don't reveal.
But it's good. I'm going to print that up and put it on my bathroom window.
Okay, so that's our show for today. Let us know what you guys thought. I tried to put some data in there, and we'll link to some articles, both in comedy and medicine, but it was a bit more opinion-based. Let us know what you guys thought. Definitely reach out to us, drvcomedian@gmail.com, and you can also reach out to us on social media. Dr. V Comedian, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're on all of them, including now TikTok. We'll have to maybe do a whole thing about medical TikTok. We can look into that a future episode. Ali, anything to plug other than your book?
For our Canadian listeners, a show called Sort Of, which I loved being part of, the lead star of which, Bilal Baig, was a guest on our show recently. And that's why I'm mentioning it, not because of my own affiliation with the show, but Sort Of comes out in the middle of November 15th in Canada. on CBC Gem, and then it'll be on in the US on HBO Max December 1st.
As I mentioned before, I love that show, and everybody should definitely catch up on the first season, watch the second season. And remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye.